just after midnight on the 8th of January 1978. My sister Kim and I were asleep in the front room of our father's house in Durban. Dad was in bed reading when a noise outside disturbed him. He came into our bedroom to investigate. I saw him go over to the window, pull the curtain aside, and then freeze. He had come face to face with his killer.
Anybody who is victimized because of his commitment to the struggle is a source of inspiration to us, especially when it is a white person who belongs to a privileged group who decides, to abandon those pleasures and identify himself with the struggle of the oppressed. That has always been a source of inspiration. I want you to know that we respect your father, and he is among some of our heroes.
He was a fantastic teacher.
He got me into a lot of trouble.
He was a symbol of hope.
Who was Rick Taylor?
Jann's dead.
To me, he was Daddy. He was the strong arms that encircled me, the soft voice that read me to sleep at night, the patient parent who reasoned with me through childhood tantrums, and who delighted in all my academic achievements. But to his friends and colleagues and comrades, the impression he made was also an indelible one. Why? Especially in one so young, because he was only 36 years old when he died. Richard Albert David Turner was born in Cape Town on September 25th, 1941. His parents were Paddy and Jane, Londoners who had come to Africa in search of a better life. They bought a farm near Stellenbosch where Richard grew up, a doted-on only child. He went to boarding school at St. George's Grammar in Cape Town, and when he was 16, he met my mother, Barbara Hubbard.
In his late teens, Richard was mainly interested in music and aeroplanes. He would listen to Lorenzo Marx radio and obsessively keep a list of all the hit parades.
I met Rick when he was 17, and I asked him, I remember in my childish way, what his ambition was for his life, and he said quite coolly that he wanted to be Secretary General of the UN.
He registered to study engineering at the University of Cape Town, but soon realized that was not for him, and changed to a course in philosophy.
By 1963, Richard was coming to the end of his undergraduate period at university and was thinking about what to do next. He wanted to go and study existentialism either in Germany or in France.
It all happened rather suddenly. They decided to get married. It was a very informal wedding, and there's probably the best photo I've ever taken is of the two of them standing there holding hands. And directly after that, literally an hour after that, they got onto the Union Castle boat and went off to France.
In 1963, we have Sharpeville, we have the Rivonia trials, we have Mandela being jailed. I think we were both relieved to leave the place.
At the Sorbonne in Paris, my father began to write his doctoral thesis on the political implications of Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy.
It was quite lonely being in Paris because I didn't really speak the language and I was pregnant. I remember running every day to the post box to wait for letters from my mother.
I was born on the 28th of November 1964.
He was looking at Sartre's two major works, Being in Nothingness and The Critique of Dialectical Reason. He actually read them both in French. It was terribly difficult. The sentences were enormously long. When Richard eventually met Sartre, he said, "Why do you write sentences pages long?" And Sartre said, "Well, I don't know, but it's for people like you who come after me to shorten them." By 1966, we were considering what to do next. Whilst we were away, South Africa had got a great deal worse. Friends had been imprisoned, like Alan Brooks, Stephanie Carroll, John Clare had been driven out. The regime had become even more repressive. However, Richard's mother, Jane, very much wanted to go away for a year, and she needed someone to take over the farm. And in the end, we decided to go back and take over the farm in Stellenbosch for a year to give her a chance to go away.
It was, I think, a difficult time for them in returning, 66, 67. because he came back basically to work the farm. And obviously that was a major disjuncture from studying existentialism in the Sorbonne to running a fruit farm in South Africa at the time.
Whilst we lived in Stellenbosch, Richard lectured at the University of Stellenbosch. It was quite an exciting time for him because he came into contact with people like Vincent Slabbert and André Blanc, and he did a lot of talking with people on the Afrikaner left, the Verlichters.
My sister Kim was born on the 8th of January 1968.
Just after Kim was born came the sit-in at the University of Cape Town, which is a pivotal moment, I think, for Richard, because it is here that he begins to be defined as a student leader.
So there was a mass meeting here at Jamison Hall, and at a particular moment the students, a group of radical students said, no, we've had enough, we're sick of these explanations, let's march. And they called on all the other student body to march down these steps, all the way down across the road to the administrative buildings down there, and they occupied them and began to run a free university. I wasn't part of the meeting that happened in Jamison Hall, and I wasn't part of the march that went down and occupied the administrative building. A couple of my friends said, what are you doing going to the normal courses? The lectures are much more interesting, much more stimulating down there in the occupied administration buildings. Come along. So I sort of tentatively went along, and indeed I was sort of seduced intellectually. And the key seducer was Rick Turner. He was a fantastic teacher. I remember these little circles of students and debates going on into the sort of early hours of the morning.
In that period, and keep in mind it was, 68 was the real heavy sort of students in Paris, and the impact of existentialism and Sartre and Camus. And it was simply an interesting variation on the usual sort of Marxist position. What he did was to give a very intense personal quality to political analysis and the whole question of activism and what one was supposed to do.
He really took seriously the idea that the task of the intellectual was not simply to analyze the world, but also to change it in a progressive way.
A group of us used to make pilgrimages out to Stellenbosch, to the family farm above Stellenbosch, where he would continue to run seminars, I think, once a week.
I went out to a number of meetings on the farm up there in Elswoerd. They never seemed to end. I mean, they just went on and on, and never really had any final resolution, except that we could get pretty passionate at times and argue. But he was also an extraordinarily gentle sort of person. He had this soft way of talking, a gentle way of talking.
In 1970, my parents separated and my father moved to Durban to take up a permanent teaching position at the University of Natal. He writes to my sister and me, here are some pictures of Durban. This is the beach. This is the harbour. Every day I go to university. Here is a picture of the university. The library for books is in this building. Here is a picture of me in my office.
He was an extraordinarily powerful popularizer. As I said, he could take complex ideas and put them forward in a very simple and persuasive way without losing, without crudifying the original positions.
He became a key advisor to white students in New Sas, while Steve Biko organized black students in Sasso.
What he formulates in the early 70s is something that I come to disagree with, which is that the role of white student politics is to prepare whites, their parents, businesses and the like for change, and that the role, and that what fits in with Steve's view, which is that blacks have to actually take the handles of change. And so black consciousness arises and says, listen, we are responsible for change.
For those of us who were youngsters, who were waging the struggle we're waging, he was a symbol of hope. Like like Bears Nadir, like Bram Fisher. He was one of those exceptional white South Africans that kept the flame of hope, that it was possible to convince white South Africans that a future non-racial in character was possible.
It was Steve Biko who introduced my father to Fazia. In April 1971, he converted to Islam so they could marry. At that time, their union contravened 3 pillars of apartheid law: the Mixed Marriages Act, the Immorality Act, and the Group Areas Act.
Do you remember when we used to go anywhere as a family? People would look at us rather strangely, and then they would think, well, their explanation would be, and they'd come up to me and say, well, are you their nanny? And I'd say, no. And Jann knew would go, no, she's not. She's my stepmother.
Somewhere deep in the jungle.
Yeah, I'm married.
Just cleaned the hair out of the plug hole with that hair.
Got a couple of kids. Just tell me if you don't like something.
Your nose. Do you want to have sex with me ever again?
Oh, yes,
Well, then shut up.
I'm not afraid of my feminine side. I feel a bit sick, actually.
Oh, this is ridiculous. People have worked and brought up kids for thousands of years.
Yes. Yeah.
The Savages.
What?
Starts Wednesday, January 15th at 8 on E!
Will you ever kill anybody again, Carl?
I don't reckon I got no reason to kill nobody. I killed some folks quite a while back. They said I wasn't right in the head, so they put me there in a nervous hospital instead of putting me in jail.
See, we're gonna be a family, Frank. My family. We can't be no normal family with him living in a garage and...
Mama said it.
Well, I tell you, that's your mama.
Mister, don't you never lay another hand on that boy. You understand me?
WWE SmackDown, next on E!
(1972) saw the publication of his book, The Eye of the Needle, a guide to participatory democracy in South Africa.
I never met Rick Turner, and wherever he is now, I suspect most good socialists are in heaven. I hope he listens and he knows that he got me into a lot of trouble. Because I was a third-year student at Stellenbosch University. And I can't remember how, but this book landed on my table and it turned my life around. I think I was looking for, I knew some things were fundamentally wrong. And I came from a good middle-class Afrikaner nationalist Free State home. I was looking for something, looking for the truth, looking for something inside me that, and this book did it for me in a sense, and I never met Rick Turner, but for a white man to say, my whiteness is coincidental, it's not really important, but this is what I think. I remember being struck most by a sense of human dignity is the most important thing in life. For me to have human dignity, all South Africans need to have human dignity. All our fellow citizens have to have it. And that is what set me on a course of political thinking and activism, which really dominated my entire life.
That he was impacting on the white student. And I think this is something that the system could not really tolerate. He wasn't simply impacting on the blacks, because the blacks were doing their own work anyway, but he was having a very profound impact on the white students. And I think that's why they banned him, and eventually they thought the best thing would be to eliminate him.
In February 1973, Richard was banned. There were a wave of banning orders, and he was banned in the same set of orders that banned Steve Biko. I was in Cape Town and he was in Durban, and I couldn't get hold of him till later that day. But I remember speaking to him on the telephone, and he was very calm about the whole thing.
The banning order was he couldn't teach. So he couldn't go to school, he couldn't go to university. He couldn't go into any industrial area, he couldn't enter a factory. He couldn't leave the magisterial district of Durban. He couldn't enter any black areas, and he couldn't publish. He could not be quoted. That was the other thing. He became silenced. So if anything had any communication with the press, it always had to be through somebody else. So it became through me, through Laurie, through a friend, but his voice was silenced.
But before the banning, some of his students had drawn him into their project of assisting black workers in the organization of trade unions. In 1973, Durban was hit by a series of major strikes, and despite the restrictions and constant security police surveillance he was now living under, labor became his central focus. Lots of men said that their bosses were not paying them enough money, so they said they would not do any more work until they got paid more. All the factories stopped, and so the bosses had to pay more to get the workers to work again. I want to write about it, so I had to try to find out what was happening.
And it's largely due to Rick. I shift from a sort of just an anti-apartheid opposition into a class-based analysis of the society. And that projects, I think, a lot of us linked to Rick into the trade union movement in 1972 and then into 73. We started the benefit fund, which in time then was the basis of Metal and Allied Workers Union, which is the core kind of tradition in NUMSA, and the Chemical Workers Industrial Union, Transport and General Workers Union, and National Union of Textile Workers. I would say that those four unions established in Durban are the core traditions in the four major unions inside, four of the major unions inside COSATU today.
The basic idea was that what we would do would be provide three things really. One would we would be able to teach. The second leg of this project was a research arm to labour. The third was, and this is something that actually has continued right into the present, is the South African Labour Bulletin. Many of the articles were indeed written by Rick, although they weren't written under his name because he was banned. He had a very healthy disrespect for the material things of life, which at the time fitted in quite well with a kind of bohemian type of existence. But bohemian doesn't actually describe it. I mean, bohemian implies dissolute and decadent. That it was never. I mean, Rick was filled with the sort of work ethic of the Protestant work ethic, disciplined, but and of course he was very abstemious in his personal habits. No alcohol, no smoking. So yeah, quite demanding actually. In fact, I'm not sure if I could have lived with Rick actually, but that was never really on the card. So
yeah, Rick. Yeah, he didn't care about how he dressed. He didn't care what food he put in his mouth. He didn't care about furnishings or anything about.
In 1976, he writes, "Dear Jann, I'm afraid I'm about 2 letters behind in answering your letters, but please don't let my laziness make you lazy. Things seem to have quietened down in Cape Town and Johannesburg. How long they'll stay quiet is another matter. The black school children were very brave to go out and demonstrate when they knew that some of them would be shot and perhaps killed. It's sad but inevitable that they should have reached a position where they see all whites as their enemies. Our government has spent the last 30 years saying that the most important thing in South Africa is the difference between black and white, and that the whites must go on ruling the blacks. They have created the race hatred, so they can hardly complain when blacks turn race hatred against whites. The demonstrators seem to have attacked anything that came from the whites, even the schools, because they see the schools as being controlled by the whites to teach them what the whites want them to know, not what they want to know themselves. Of course, it doesn't help to burn down schools, but sometimes people get so angry that they stop thinking about what will help. They just attack anything which reminds them of their anger. Unfortunately, it's a natural reaction, and unfortunately the whites do not seem to be able to understand this. The reaction of the police to the demonstrations has created many martyrs, and it will take many years before blacks forget the killings."
And I visited him, I think about 2-3 months before he was assassinated. at his house, sat and talked and so on. And I remember we were talking about the political situation and how he saw it and what would happen, and he was, I think he was a bit apprehensive. Maybe he had some sense or feeling of what could happen. Not for him personally, but that things were going to get pretty tough.
In September 77, Steve Biko was killed in detention. It was a terrible blow. Dad's banning order was due to expire the following year, and he hoped to be free to take up a Humboldt scholarship in Germany. But that was not to be.
I remember when Rick was shot in '78. I was a war correspondent up in Namibia doing Angola and Namibia, the independence struggles and the wars up there. And I heard it on the radio. And I thought for a long time, why would a man who is so profoundly a peaceful, loving man, who is so dedicated his life to human dignity, which is what I saw in him, it's like fighting for human dignity. Why would somebody kill him? There's so many other people that you could kill. Why kill a symbol of peace and sharing? And then, yeah, you figure it out. That is why they killed him. Because in that society there wasn't room for caring and sharing and love and dignity.
I don't think, your dad never dies. It's interesting. I mean, there's a sense in which I grow older and older, and he stays the same.
Whenever we gather together as a family, I think it's always evident that there's somebody missing. When Jann got married, when both my children were born, there's always a gap for us all. There's someone who should be there and who isn't. And it's very hard because you can't imagine what he would be like now as a person, or how he would feel about the world as it is, or how he would interact with his children. But it's just that he's somebody we would like to have there. He should have had the chance to see his grandchildren. He should have had the chance to see South Africa as it is now. All those things he missed, and that's something that I'll always be sad about. I have never met anyone as clever as Richard, and I have never met anyone with that clarity of thinking, because he didn't let his personal feelings get in the way of his political judgment.
I think of him now always as that how different our politics would have been, and how different the debate would have been. I'm not certain the politics would necessarily be different, because I think that's giving too much influence to a single person, but how different the debate would have been. And I've constantly said that I think about him as someone who would have held us true, who would have taken weak propositions and subjected them to scrutiny, forced us to think differently.
I'd like to say with deep humility that here's one of those South Africans who, in his own way, kept the intellect and the conscience of our society alive.
So, Rick Turner, I hope you're listening. I don't know how many people see you as someone who had a profound effect on life, but you had a profound effect on my life. And that's kind of special, you know? You're up there with John Lennon.
Freedom. But freedom here is only a name. If we wish to penetrate further into the question, we must not be content with this reply, and we ought to ask, what is human freedom if through it nothingness comes into the world? Okay, the major point that I want to make here is that to be able to question, to be able to negate is to be able to withdraw from and hence become independent of the object which one is questioning. And this is what is meant by freedom.